All right, so we're still looking at the problem of pride, and remember that we're under the heading of twisted humility. So in this, we've been looking at the dangers of pride and how it destroys our relationship with God, but it also destroys our relationship with others. It's important to remember as we go through this series and as we go through these others, these conditions of our heart, they prohibit us from functioning properly in our relationships with, again, others and with God. Let me say that again. These conditions in our heart, remember we're going to be looking at 4 conditions, and there's so many different parts to each one of those. Right now we're looking at twisted humility. They prohibit us from functioning properly in our relationship with God and in our relationship with other people. Before we jump right into the lesson, I want to, once again, every week I'm going to give you these definitions. Right now we're really focusing in on 2 definitions of pride. There are a couple of more that we're going to get, and all of these things that we're looking at of pride is just to help us to get a better understanding of it, so that we can make sure that it's not operating in our life. And so the first definition we gave, and this was really a big focus that we looked at in the garden, but that first one is my own personal definition of pride, and pride is the attempt to take God off the throne and putting yourself in his place. It's the attempt. I use that language on purpose because of the simple fact is that we can't really remove God off the throne. Now, what we can do is not allow God to operate and be king in our own life. And that's the awesomeness of God, is that he's not going to force himself on you. If you don't want him, guess what? You don't have to have him. And so in the garden, we saw how taking God and removing him out of the equation is another way that you can put it. That's seen in many different type of ways. So removing God out of the equation, or taking him off the throne and trying to put yourself in his place, it may mean that I feel like I can make better decisions at running my own life than he can. It may be I put all of my plans, all of my projects, everything that I've always wanted to do, I may put that thing in the forefront, and I'm not really even worried about what it is that God wants done or what he's doing around me. And so those are a few examples. You'll see clearly more and more as we go through this series. The second definition is one that was presented by Dr. Daniel Napier. We looked at that last week, and we're going to really look at the opposite side of it this week. But just listen to this. Daniel Napier says it this way. He says, pride is a deficiency of love. And so think of the 2 greatest commandments that Jesus brought forth, right? He said, love God with all your might and all this stuff, and then love your neighbor as yourself, right? Loving God and loving others. He said it's a deficiency of love. It's a lack of understanding of that love. And he also says that it's an illusion that my value or my significance comes from how I compare to other human beings. And so last week, the focus was on how it can cause us to see ourselves in a negative light based off the way that we compare to somebody else. Let me say that again. Last week when we looked at Cain and Abel, we saw that when Cain's offering was not acceptable, it caused him to look at himself in a certain way. He looked at himself in a negative light. He saw himself less than. He had a problem with himself. He felt some type of way about himself based off of how he compared to his brother. Right? We looked at that, but this week we're going to kind of change it up a little bit, right? So this week is the other side of the coin, right? So last week was when I compare myself to somebody, I feel less than. I feel less valued. I feel less significant. I feel like I don't matter as much as they matter. And that's one side of the coin. But if you flip the coin over, this week we'll look at, instead of us looking at ourselves in a negative light, pride causes us to be puffed up in such a way that we begin to look down on others. So one way we feel bad about ourselves, the other way we feel good about ourselves, because when we compare ourselves to other people, they're not where I am. I'm much better than they are. Look at all the stuff that I'm doing and look at all the wrong that they're doing. And so it's kind of two sides of that coin when we're looking at Dr. Napier's definition of pride, this whole idea of comparison, this competition that comes in and takes place in our life. One way we feel bad about ourselves, and in another way we elevate ourselves and begin to start looking down on those around us. So either way, we don't understand the love of God, and we don't understand his love that's directed towards us. And so that's important. The reason why we make these comparisons, whether it's to make ourselves feel good and make them feel less than, or we look at somebody and say, I don't measure up to them, so God can't love me the same way. No matter which way it is, we don't really understand the love of God. And I think that's where Dr. Napier was going when he said it's a deficiency of love. I don't understand how God loves me. I don't understand how he loves everybody else. And I don't understand how I'm supposed to love others. And this happens when we take God off the throne of our life and begin to view ourselves and others through a distorted set of lenses. Remember that. When we remove him out of the equation and see ourselves wrong, see other people wrong, we're looking through a distorted pair of lenses. Anytime God is taken out of the equation for whatever reason, whether it's we want to move beyond the bounds that he set up, I don't want to be tied down, or whether we just feel like I think I can do this better than you can, our reality becomes twisted and distorted in some way, and we see things totally wrong. So today, as we're continuing to look at this problem of pride, we're in part 3 of this series, and we're going to be looking at Luke chapter 18 verses 9 through 14. And so let's go ahead and move along. The first thing, let's kind of look at the setting of everything that's going on here, and it's in verses 9 and 10 of chapter 18, and I'm just going to read it. I'm reading out of the ESV translation, but just listen to this. It says, he also told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and treated others with contempt. 2 men went up into the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. And so here, when you look at the setting, Jesus tells a parable, right? A parable is a story of some kind with a truth that's laid down beside it. You can also say it's a story that's being told that has some type of wisdom laid side by side with the story, and its intent is to help us to get to repent or to change our thinking on some things. It's to help us to think differently about that person, the situation, or just think differently about life in general. That's what these parables are for. When Jesus is telling them, he tells a story, he tells them to us in such a way that there's truth in it, there's wisdom in it, and it's going to help me to get from one place where I'm at to where he is trying to get me to. And so that's what Jesus is doing here. He's telling the story. And it says that it was directed to some of those in the crowd that were around him. Just think about this. Like, Jesus is not just telling a random story and just like, oh, if you get something from it, you get something from it. But he's actually directing this at some of the people that are actually right there, right? Because he understood their heart. He understood that they looked at people in a certain way. And this is what their heart looks like. It says that they were people who trusted in their own righteousness. Another way you can say that is they trusted in their own rightness. When we're talking about rightness, and when you look at the context of the text, the righteousness here, it has to do with being in right standing with God. I'm in the right place with God that I'm supposed to be in comparison to these other people. And that's the attitude of pride. That's the behavior that comes with pride. And it also says it was those who their lifestyle was one of looking down on others. The word that's used here is contempt, right? When you begin to look down on another person and devalue them in some type of way. The point of you having contempt for them is to make them feel less than. And it says that they thought they was right with God, but they viewed other people in this way, and they felt they were right in doing so. And so that's a problem. This was a lifestyle for them. This wasn't just something that every once in a while that came up in their head. This was some people that this is the way they viewed other people, and that everything that they were doing was right because in their own mind, they knew how to be right with God. But even in this setting, it kind of we're going to close out this setting portion with two opposite ends of a spectrum. All right, on one end you got a Pharisee, and on this other end you got a tax collector. It says they go up to the temple to pray, right? The Pharisees were one out of you could really say like four main groups in Jewish groups in Palestine at that time. You had the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, you had the Zealots, but the Pharisees was probably the most popular out of all these groups. The Pharisees were big on purity. They felt like that there were certain things that were in the law that if we just do these things, that our lives would be pure and we would be right before God. And then you had the tax collectors who were basically extorting their own people for money. Nobody liked them. And so there's still something else that we need to say before we even move forward. And that's our problematic view of Pharisees and tax collectors based off of what we hear in our churches. This is what I mean by that. Sunday after Sunday, you hear these sermons, whether it's, Sunday morning doing service, or maybe it's in Bible study, maybe it's in Sunday school, whatever it is, and you see that Jesus constantly has this conflict with the Pharisees. You see it. You're like, look at them. Look at how Jesus is interacting with them, and why are they always coming at Jesus in this type of way? And so our view is the Pharisees is the bad guy, and the problem with that is in their culture and in the context of what's going on here, they would not have been seen as the bad guy. Like I said a while ago, the tax collector would have been the one that was excluded from everything. People looked at them and put their lifestyle on the same level as somebody that was a sinner, because a lot of the stuff was you're extorting your own people for money, and so they couldn't stand, these tax collectors. The Pharisees, even though they were probably very strict in how they wanted you to do these religious things, they were still considered religious people, and they were a part of any of those customs that the Jews were in, the temple, the synagogues, all of that stuff that was surrounded and wrapped up and considered somebody to be a Jew. They were a part of that. Tax collectors were not. And so we a lot of times look at scripture and we see this and we're like, oh, here go the Pharisees again. But we need to understand how this would have been viewed in their day. And so keep that in mind as you're listening to this, because some of these Pharisees were there, but you got to remember that there's other people here, and this is going to blow the mind of so many people. And so that's the setting. But let's look here real quick at the Pharisee. Let's look at what's going on right here with the Pharisee. It's in verse 11 and it's in verse 12. It says, the Pharisee standing by himself prayed thus, God, I thank you that I'm not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all that I get. Just pay attention to the Pharisee's attitude and his outlook on life. Just look at his attitude towards other people and really pay attention to his attitude towards himself. Remember, we're talking about the problem of pride. This whole idea of getting God out of the way. And so we see things the way we want to see them rather than how God says we ought to see them. And that's where you get that next definition of I need to compare myself with somebody. And remember, now we're looking at this definition of somebody puffing themselves up to make other people less than themselves. And so one of the first things you see here is he's highlighting the sins, or he's highlighting the wrongs of others. He's making it clear of how wrong they are. Everybody's here in the temple. We're praying and all of this stuff. And he's like, he's so arrogant at this moment. It's amazing. I'm not like the extortioners. I'm not like these ones that cheat on their wives. I'm not like so-and-so them. I don't do the things that they do. And I'm especially nothing like that tax collector that's sitting or standing right over there. And so he's highlighting the sins, or he's highlighting the wrongs of everybody else. And that's the attitude of somebody that's filled with pride. But the second part of that is that he's highlighting how right he is. Right? Pay attention. He says, I fast twice a week, right? And I give tithes of everything that I get, right? I heard somebody say that he's an overachiever, right? Because the Jews wasn't commanded to fast twice a week. If you fast twice a week, that's you doing so much more than what's required of you. There's nothing wrong with fasting twice a week, but if you're thinking that's going to make you closer with God just because you're fasting twice a week and they're not doing it, you got another thing coming, because righteousness doesn't depend on the stuff that we do. Our righteousness comes from somebody else, and his name is Jesus the Christ. We're right with God. We're in right standing with God based off of what Jesus did, not with what we do. I don't care how much right you do. I don't care how much you point out wrong somebody else is doing. Jesus is the reason we are considered righteous. And we too fall into this trap, right? We constantly point out what others are doing wrong, and it make it seem like all of their wrongs they don't compare to mine. Even if I do something wrong, it's nothing like so-and-so does. We fall into that same trap today. We want to compare ourselves by highlighting all the bad stuff that they're doing, and then my stuff Yeah, I do a little bit of something, but it's nothing like theirs. So forget mine, focus on theirs. We fall into that same trap. And when we have enough pride in our life, what we'll do is we not only kind of downplay our stuff, but we'll try to act like we don't really have nothing going on at all. This is that other side of the coin that I talked about, right? Pride can cause you and I to be puffed up in such a way that we just begin to look down on others. You don't mean as much to God as I do. You're not as valuable to him as I am. That's the attitude we have. You don't matter to him like I matter to him. Don't you know I fast twice a week? Don't you know God can really use me because I don't do the stuff that you do? That's the attitude that we bring to the table, and we think that we are right in that attitude. And so that's the Pharisee. But let's look at the tax collector. It's in verse 13. So verse 13 says, but the tax collector, standing far off, would not even look up his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. This is a great picture of humility, right? Just think of his reason for standing off by himself, right? Just keep two things in mind here. I want you to keep two things in mind: community and contamination, right? So when I say community, this whole idea of coming to the temple to pray at multiple times of the day, morning, afternoon, in the evening, these different prayers, it was a community type thing. It was a shared thing. We did it together. We stood together. And so even things they did in the synagogue and just the things that Jews did together, it was a community type thing. But look at the aspect of contamination. It's him, because he know he has some wrong. It's the idea of him saying, let me stand back over here all by myself, with not necessarily of literally, I'm going to contaminate you, I'm going to pass on the stuff to you, but the idea of, I really don't deserve to be in community right now based off of the stuff that I've done. And so he understands how sin can corrupt a person's life. One way to look at humility is this: is constantly having before me the realization, right? The understanding that God is the most important thing in my life. That means that I got God back at the center of things. He's the most important thing in my life, and that my fellow humanity or everybody else that's human and I are created in the image of God. So there's no need to compare and there's no need to compete. This is the picture that's here. He understands I don't need to compare myself with nobody else, but I just need to focus on what's wrong with me at the moment. And that can only be done when God is back at the center of things, and that we trusting that God knows better than we can. And when we understand that we have already gone beyond the bounds that God has set up, instead of pointing out what so did, like the Pharisee did, he said, Lord, have mercy on me, a sinner. He understood that God is on the throne. He don't deserve to be there. And he understood that he was living a lifestyle of sin, and he was asking for the mercies of God. We know that mercy means God don't give you what you really do deserve. And so he's asking for the grace of God to be on his life to help move him from where he is. Humility gives us the proper view of God and ourselves, right? Just think of him talking about, not just saying a little bit about it, but just think about having a proper view of God, that he understands that even though God has the power to do certain things, God is gentle. God is merciful, and that's the reason why he's calling for the mercy of God right now. He understands that God is compassionate, right? That God works things in our favor when he doesn't have to. He understands these things. And so with humility, when we're humble, we have this proper view of God, but we also have a proper view of ourselves. If at the moment I'm actually doing stuff I don't have no business doing, there's no need for me to act like I'm doing all the right stuff. And so that's what humility does. It gives us a proper view of God, but it also gives us a proper view of ourselves. And in that, we'll have a proper view of other people. And so we looked at the setting, we looked at the Pharisee, and we looked at this tax collector, and we're going to close with the ruling. It's in verse 14. Just listen to what Jesus says. I tell you, this man, talking about the tax collector, went down to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but the one who humbles himself will be exalted, will be lifted up. Listen, he says that the tax collector went away right with God because of his heart. It was the tax collector is the one that went away right with God. He went away justified. He went away with God saying, don't worry about everything that you've done. You came to me and I'm going to take care of everything. Right? It's not dismissing the wrong, but it's saying, guess what? That's the attitude I want for those that stand before me and those that follow me. Right? It says that everyone will be humbled, or everyone will be brought low that try to raise themselves above others in the attitude of their mind, trying to make yourself better. See, all of this is an attitude in the mind that causes the wrong type of behavior. You're trying to raise yourself above others. And not only that, we try to do this by raising above the bounds or the standard that God has in place. We know that everybody's created in the image of God. So why am I not only seeing you that way, but why am I not treating you in that way? And so that Pharisee, he had a hard time relating with anybody because he saw himself much higher and he was able to look down. And Jesus says that type of attitude of raising yourself up, you're going to be brought low. You're going to get to the point to where that's going to destroy your life. You're going to get to the point to where you're going to be so messed up, nobody wants to be around you. Nobody wants to be in a relationship with you. And it's going to cause a problem not only in your relationship with others, but it's going to cause a problem in your relationship with God. This is the reason for that. When we try to rise above the bounds that God has in place, we have an attitude of how I see things is greater than what God had in mind. That's what it looks like to rise above the bounds. These are the fence you got. This is the standard that you set up, Lord, but I want to rise above that. And what I'm saying is, the way you had it set up, or the way you want things done, I think I can do better than that. I think I know better. I don't think that's the right way for me. And I'm going to try to get as many people as I can to believe the same thing. That's one of the reasons why there's a problem. But the second thing is, this leads us to putting ourselves higher than others in importance before God. In worth and in value before God, and having an attitude that we matter more to God than they do. Let me say that one more time. This leads us to putting ourselves higher than others in importance to God, worth and value to God, and having an attitude that we matter more to God than they do. Oh, this attitude of mind and heart causes us to do some stuff that's totally outrageous. It makes absolutely no sense to nobody but ourselves and other people that are prideful as well. And so there's a few things that you can reflect on, and we're closing now. Just something that you can reflect on, and if you want to discuss with you and some other people later on, there are a few things that I want you to kind of pay attention to. First, honestly, who are you more like in this story? The Pharisee or the tax collector? Why is that, and what needs to change in your life? Figure it out. Be honest with yourself. Who are you more like, the Pharisee or the tax collector? Have you been to the point to where you've been humbled? Or are you filled with pride like the Pharisee? And why do you think that is? And what is the stuff that needs to change in your life? That's the first thing. Second thing is this. Do you find yourself always talking about how wrong others are, or always talking about what ways they are wrong? Right? Are you constantly pointing out how wrong everybody else is and going so far as to explain the ways that they are wrong? And why do you think you do that? That's the second thing. The third thing is this. When it comes to you, do you find yourself bringing up all that you do right, and it begins to make you feel or to think that because of those things you must be right before God? Does this cause you to look down on others? And you need to understand that. Do you constantly bring up everything that you've been doing? This is right. You know all the right stuff I do, and so I gotta be right before God. Think about those things. And so just remember, the fourth thing is this. Remember what I said about humility. Constantly having before me the realization that God is the most important thing in my life, and that my fellow humanity and I are all created in the image of God. So there's no need to compare or compete. What can you start doing today and every day after to have this attitude of humility? That God is the most important thing, and that all of us are created in the image of God, so I don't need to compare or compete with you. What can you start doing today and every day for the rest of your life to have that attitude? And lastly, how did you previously view pride and humility? How has your thinking changed since we've been going through this series? And we're not done with it yet. Grace, mercy, and peace be with you.